The wind carried shards of ice through the narrow alley behind Miller Street, turning every breath into visible clouds that hung in the fluorescent glow of broken streetlights. Nora Hale gripped the handlebars of her delivery bicycle tighter, knuckles red and raw, despite the thin gloves that had worn through at the fingertips weeks ago. The digital clock on her cracked phone screen read 47 minutes past 1 in the morning, and the battery indicator blinked a warning red at 3%. Her last delivery of the night sat secured in the insulated bag behind her seat. Lukewarm Chinese takeout that someone in the Harbor District had ordered 43 minutes ago. The GPS app kept recalculating her route as construction barriers and emergency vehicles blocked the main thoroughfares, adding precious minutes to an already tight schedule. Each delay meant potential docking from her pay, and Nora could not afford another financial hit. The mobile banking app on her phone showed the brutal mathematics of survival in stark digital clarity. Checking account balance, $63.12. Rent due 3 days ago, $412. Late fee already applied, $35 additional. The refrigerator in her studio apartment contained exactly 1 packet of instant rice, half a carton of milk that would expire tomorrow, and 3 slices of bread growing spots of green mold along the edges. She pedaled harder against the wind, tires struggling for grip on patches of black ice that formed in the shadows between streetlights. The delivery company uniform, a bright yellow windbreaker with reflective strips, had seemed adequate when she started this job 6 months ago, but now every seam leaked cold air. The fabric had faded to a sickly mustard color, and the company logo peeled off in strips that caught on door handles and bike chains. Her phone buzzed with a notification that made her stomach drop. Transit Eats customer service. Driver, 4471. Delivery window exceeded by 9 minutes. Late penalty of $85 will be applied to next payment cycle. The screen went black as the battery finally died, leaving her with only the mechanical ticking of the bicycle chain and the distant hum of traffic on the highway overpass. Nora coasted to a stop beneath a streetlight and pulled out the backup phone she had bought for $12 at a pawn shop. The device took nearly 2 minutes to power on, ancient Android software loading with painful slowness. When the delivery app finally launched, it displayed a new route calculation that made her curse under her breath. Construction had closed Harbor Avenue entirely, forcing a detour that would add another 20 minutes to her journey. But there was an alternative. The app suggested a service road that ran behind St. Catherine Private Hospital, cutting through a restricted access area that would shave 15 minutes off her route. The path showed in dotted yellow on the map, labeled with a small warning icon that she dismissed without reading. 15 minutes could mean the difference between losing the $85 penalty and potentially earning the $120 completion bonus for finishing 12 deliveries before sunrise. The memory of her younger brother Jake surfaced unbidden as she stared at the hospital complex through the chain-link fence. 3 years ago, he had been brought to a different hospital, a public one across town, with pneumonia that had developed into respiratory distress. No insurance, no money for private care. She had watched him struggle to breathe while they waited in an overcrowded emergency room for 6 hours, his lips turning blue as his oxygen levels dropped. The staff did their best with limited resources, but the image of her brother gasping for air while surrounded by indifferent bureaucracy had never left her consciousness. She shook off the memory and focused on the immediate problem. The service road entrance was 50 yards ahead, marked by orange cones and a sign reading, "Hospital personnel only. Unauthorized access prohibited." But there were no guards visible, no cameras that she could detect, just a narrow pathway that led around the back of the building, past loading docks and emergency generator housings. The decision crystallized in her mind with the cold clarity of desperation. $20 in fuel costs for her bike each week, $37 for her phone plan, $15 for laundry at the coin-operated machines, groceries when she could afford them, maybe $60 if she ate nothing but rice and canned vegetables. The mathematics of poverty allowed no margin for missed bonuses or late penalties. Nora adjusted her grip on the handlebars and pedaled toward the service entrance. The orange cones scraped against her bike frame as she slipped between them, the sound sharp and metallic in the quiet night air. Behind her, the city continued its late-night rhythm of sirens and traffic, oblivious to one delivery driver cutting through restricted territory to make rent on time. The hospital loomed ahead, its windows glowing with the sterile light of 24-hour medical care that she could never afford for herself. Her breath came in steady puffs as she navigated the narrow service road. Following the faint yellow line painted down the center of the asphalt, the delivery bag bounced slightly against her back with each pedal stroke, the takeout containers shifting and settling. Somewhere in the distance, an ambulance siren wailed, growing louder, then fading away as it carried someone else toward emergency care. The emergency generators hummed their mechanical lullaby behind steel housing units, creating a low-frequency vibration that Nora could feel through the bicycle frame as she navigated the service road. The air carried the sharp scent of industrial disinfectant, mixed with something she recognized from her brother's hospital stay, that particular combination of bleach and desperation that clung to medical facilities like an invisible fog. Snow continued to fall in lazy spirals, collecting on her shoulders and melting against the warm delivery bag. She rounded the corner past a loading dock where empty oxygen cylinders stood chained together like metal sentries, their surfaces gleaming dully under the sodium lights. The GPS on her backup phone showed she had cut 8 minutes from her projected arrival time, which meant she might still make the delivery window and avoid the penalty. But as she approached the rear exit ramp that would take her back to public roads, a sound stopped her cold. It was barely audible above the generator noise, a rhythmic electronic beeping that grew more urgent with each repetition. The pattern was distinctive, unmistakable to anyone who had spent long hours in hospital waiting rooms. It was the sound of a medical device in distress, calling for attention that was not coming. Nora coasted to a stop and tilted her head, trying to locate the source. There, on the concrete steps leading to an emergency exit, sat a figure that seemed impossibly small against the institutional backdrop of the hospital. A child, maybe 7 or 8 years old, huddled against the metal railing with his knees drawn up to his chest. Even from 30 feet away, Nora could see the telltale signs of respiratory distress. The shallow, rapid chest movements, the way he held his shoulders rigid, the slight forward lean that she remembered from her brother's worst episodes. The boy wore clothes that told a story of privilege even in his current state of crisis. His navy blue hoodie was made of expensive fleece, the kind that kept its shape after multiple washings and bore a designer label she recognized from store windows she could never afford to enter. His sneakers were pristine white leather with minimal scuffing, probably purchased within the last month. But his skin had taken on an alarming grayish pallor, and she could see moisture beading on his forehead, despite the freezing temperature. A small device clipped to his wrist pulsed with angry red light. A pulse oximeter, she realized, the same type they had used to monitor her brother's oxygen saturation. The beeping grew more insistent as she watched, each tone sharper and more demanding than the last. Beside him on the concrete lay a discarded thermal blanket with the hospital logo, and what appeared to be an inhaler that had rolled several feet away from his reach. Nora felt her chest tighten with familiar anxiety. Every instinct told her to keep riding, to complete her delivery, and avoid any complications that might arise from involvement with what was clearly a medical emergency. She was not a doctor, not a nurse, barely qualified to provide basic first aid. Her knowledge came from a free community course she had taken 2 years ago when she thought she might apply for EMT training, before the reality of tuition costs and certification fees crushed that ambition. But the sound of the child's labored breathing carried across the cold air with devastating clarity. She could hear the wheeze on each exhalation, the way his breath caught and stuttered as his airways constricted. The pulse oximeter continued its frantic beeping, indicating that his blood oxygen levels were dropping to dangerous thresholds. And there was no one else around. No medical personnel rushing to help, no concerned parents hovering nearby, no security guards making their rounds. She dismounted her bicycle and approached cautiously, her delivery bag bumping against her back with each step. The boy looked up as she drew near, and she saw eyes that were bright with fever and wide with the kind of fear that comes when breathing becomes a conscious effort rather than an automatic function. His lips had a faint blue tinge that made her stomach clench with recognition. Up close, she could see the medical alert bracelet wrapped around his thin wrist. The metal plate was engraved with information that made her pulse quicken. E. Hale, severe allergy, azithromycin, emergency contact, followed by a phone number. She knew that medication name from her first aid training, a commonly prescribed antibiotic that could trigger severe allergic reactions in sensitive patients. The inhaler that lay beyond his reach was labeled with a prescription sticker, and she could see that it contained albuterol, a bronchodilator used to treat asthma attacks. But there was something else scattered on the ground nearby, an empty vial with a label that made her blood run cold. Azithromycin injection. Administered less than an hour ago, according to the timestamp on the medical tape still adhering to his arm. Someone had given this child exactly the medication his bracelet warned against. Someone had either ignored or failed to read the allergy information that was clearly displayed on his wrist. And now he was experiencing what appeared to be a severe allergic reaction, combined with respiratory distress, alone on the back steps of the hospital that should have been protecting him. The boy tried to speak, but could only manage a whispered help that came out as barely more than an exhalation. His hands trembled as he pointed toward the inhaler, but when he tried to lean forward to reach it, the movement triggered a coughing fit that left him gasping and even more breathless than before. The pulse oximeter reading on its small screen showed 87%, a number that she knew was dangerously low. Nora looked around quickly, scanning for any sign of medical personnel or security cameras that might indicate help was on the way. But the service area remained empty, illuminated only by the harsh industrial lighting and the occasional flicker of emergency beacons. The main hospital entrance was at least 200 yards away, and she could see no immediate way to summon assistance without leaving the child alone. The beeping of the pulse oximeter seemed to grow more urgent with each passing second, creating a soundtrack of medical crisis that demanded immediate action. Nora dropped to her knees beside the boy without hesitation, her delivery bag sliding off her shoulder and landing with a soft thud on the concrete. The pulse oximeter's urgent beeping filled the space between them, each tone a stark reminder that his blood oxygen levels were dropping into dangerous territory. She could see the reading clearly now, 85% and falling, with his heart rate spiking at 120 beats per minute. "Hey, can you hear me?" she asked softly, positioning herself directly in his line of sight. The boy's eyes focused on her with visible effort, pupils slightly dilated from the combination of medication reaction and oxygen deprivation. She noticed the way his nostrils flared with each labored breath, and how he instinctively leaned forward to ease the work of breathing. Classic signs of respiratory distress that she recognized from her community first aid training. She reached for the dropped inhaler, checking the label quickly to confirm it contained albuterol sulfate, the standard bronchodilator used to relax constricted airways. The device felt cold in her hands, and she could see that it had been used recently based on the dose counter reading. But something was wrong with his breathing pattern that went beyond simple asthma symptoms. "I'm going to help you sit up properly, okay?" Nora positioned herself behind him, supporting his back and shoulders to achieve the optimal angle for breathing. She remembered the instructor's voice from her first aid course. Position matters. Sitting upright with slight forward lean opens the airways and reduces the work of breathing. The boy's body felt fragile against her hands, all sharp angles and tension. She examined the medical alert bracelet more carefully, noting not just the azithromycin allergy, but also the emergency contact information. The phone number was local, but more importantly, she noticed additional medical information etched in tiny print. Asthma, exercise-induced, albuterol rescue, EpiPen authorized. This wasn't just an asthma attack. It was a compound emergency involving both allergic reaction and respiratory distress. The boy tried to speak, managing only a whispered, "Can't breathe." His lips were more visibly cyanotic now, and she could see the telltale retractions around his rib cage as his accessory muscles strained to draw air into constricted lungs. The wheeze on expiration was audible even without a stethoscope, a high-pitched sound that spoke of severely narrowed airways. "I know it's scary, but I need you to try to breathe with me," Nora said, her voice steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. She held up the inhaler, shaking it vigorously to ensure the medication was properly mixed. "We're going to use this together, but I need you to follow my breathing pattern first." She demonstrated the technique she had learned, taking a deep breath through her nose and exhaling slowly through pursed lips, creating a visible cloud in the cold air. In through your nose if you can, out through your mouth, slow and steady. Try to match my rhythm. The boy's breathing was too rapid and shallow, which would prevent the medication from reaching deep into his lungs where it was needed most. With careful movements, she created an improvised spacer using an empty plastic bottle from her delivery bag, cutting the bottom off with a key from her keychain and inverting it to create a chamber. The technique was crude, but functional. She had seen paramedics use similar field expedients when proper equipment wasn't available. "This is going to help the medicine get deeper into your lungs," she explained, fitting the makeshift device over the inhaler's mouthpiece. She administered the first puff of albuterol, counting out the 4 breaths he should take from the improvised spacer. His coordination was poor due to the distress, but she guided him through each inhalation, watching his chest rise and fall with each cycle. The pulse oximeter reading held steady at 84%, not improving yet, but not dropping further. "That's good. You're doing really well," she encouraged, though she knew 1 dose likely wouldn't be sufficient for this level of respiratory compromise. She watched the seconds tick by on her phone's timer, waiting the recommended interval before administering additional medication. During this pause, she noticed something that made her stomach clench with recognition. There was a small puncture wound on his upper arm, still marked with the adhesive remnants of medical tape. Next to it lay a discarded syringe with a label that confirmed her worst fears: azithromycin injection, administered approximately 45 minutes earlier according to the timestamp. Someone had given this child exactly the antibiotic his medical alert bracelet warned against, and they had done so recently enough that the allergic reaction was still building in intensity. She looked around frantically for any sign of medical personnel who might have treated him. But the service area remained deserted, except for the mechanical hum of hospital equipment and the distant sound of traffic. No one was coming to check on him, which meant either the staff didn't realize the mistake they had made, or worse, they didn't know he was out here. The timer on her phone chimed, indicating it was time for the second round of medication. She shook the inhaler again and prepared to administer another dose through her improvised spacer system. "We're going to do this again, and I think you'll start feeling a little better this time," she told him, though she could see that his breathing remained severely compromised. As she guided him through the second series of inhalations, she noticed that his pulse oximeter reading finally showed a slight improvement. 86%, then 87%. Still dangerously low, but moving in the right direction. His respiratory rate remained elevated, but the wheeze seemed slightly less pronounced on expiration. The boy managed to whisper, "Thank you," between breaths, and she could see that some of the panic was leaving his eyes as the bronchodilator began to take effect. The sound of car doors slamming in synchronized precision cut through the winter air like gunshots, each metallic thud echoing off the hospital's concrete walls with mechanical authority. Nora looked up from where she knelt beside Eli, her hands still supporting his shoulders as his breathing gradually stabilized. The pulse oximeter now read 91%, still low, but climbing steadily as the albuterol continued to work its way through his constricted airways. 3 black sedans had materialized in the service area, as if summoned from the shadows, their engines idling with the quiet efficiency of expensive machinery. The vehicles were identical: sleek, dark-tinted windows, license plates that reflected the fluorescent lights like mirrors. Steam rose from their hoods in the cold air, suggesting they had traveled at considerable speed to reach this location. The first man to emerge wore a charcoal wool overcoat that probably cost more than Nora made in 3 months of deliveries. Even from 50 feet away, she could see the quality of the fabric, the way it moved with his body without a single wrinkle or imperfection. His shoes left precise prints in the thin layer of snow as he approached, leather soles that clicked against concrete with mathematical regularity, but it was his face that made her breath catch in her throat. The resemblance to the boy beside her was unmistakable. The same strong jawline, the same dark hair, the same intensely focused eyes that seemed to take in every detail of a situation within seconds. This was clearly Eli's father, and the way the other men arranged themselves around him spoke of authority that went far beyond simple parental concern. Victor Hale moved toward them with controlled urgency, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air as his gaze locked onto his son's face. She could see the moment he registered the pulse oximeter's readings, the way his jaw tightened when he noticed the medical alert bracelet, the almost imperceptible flinch when he spotted the discarded azithromycin vial lying on the concrete steps. 2 additional men flanked him, their hands resting casually inside their overcoats in positions that suggested concealed weapons. They scanned the area with practiced efficiency, noting exit routes, potential witnesses, and sight lines from the hospital windows above. One of them spoke quietly into a radio, his voice too low for Nora to make out the words. But the tone carried the crisp authority of military or law enforcement background. What happened to him? Victor's voice cut through the mechanical hum of the generators, and Nora felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter temperature. There was steel beneath the parental concern, a controlled danger that made her acutely aware of how vulnerable she was in this isolated service area. She forced herself to maintain steady eye contact as she answered. Someone gave him azithromycin. He's allergic. It's right there on his medical bracelet. He was having a severe allergic reaction combined with bronchospasm when I found him. She gestured toward the empty vial and the discarded thermal blanket. I've given him 2 doses of albuterol through an improvised spacer. His oxygen saturation is improving, but he needs proper medical attention. Victor's gaze flicked to the makeshift breathing apparatus she had constructed from her delivery supplies, then back to the pulse oximeter display. The reading now showed 93%, and Eli's breathing had settled into a more regular pattern, though he still leaned heavily against Nora for support. You're not medical personnel. It wasn't a question. Victor's eyes took in her faded delivery uniform, the bicycle propped against the loading dock, the insulated bag that had spilled Chinese takeout containers across the concrete. What are you doing here? The man with the radio moved closer, his hand shifting position inside his coat. Nora felt the weight of multiple stares, the sudden awareness that she had stumbled into something far more complicated than a simple medical emergency. But Eli's small hand was still gripping her fingers, and she could feel his pulse through his wrist, still elevated, but stronger than it had been 20 minutes ago. I was cutting through the service road to make a delivery on time, she said, keeping her voice level despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. I found him having trouble breathing. I couldn't just leave him there. She paused, then added, Someone in that hospital gave him exactly the medication his bracelet says will kill him. They either didn't read it, or they didn't care. The temperature in Victor's eyes dropped several degrees. He knelt beside his son, his expensive overcoat pooling in the snow as he gently touched Eli's forehead, checking for fever. When he spoke, his voice carried the kind of quiet fury that was infinitely more dangerous than shouting. Who treated him? I want names, departments, shift supervisors. I want to know every person who came into contact with my son in the last 2 hours. The man with the radio immediately began speaking into his device, rattling off instructions in rapid coded language. Eli managed to whisper "Dad" through his improving but still labored breathing. The single word seemed to crack something in Victor's carefully controlled facade. His hand trembled almost imperceptibly as he smoothed his son's hair back from his forehead, and Nora caught a glimpse of the terrified father beneath the dangerous exterior. I'm here, Eli. You're going to be okay. Victor's voice softened when addressing his son, but when he looked back at Nora, the steel returned. You said he's improving. What did you do exactly? She explained the positioning, the breathing techniques, the improvised spacer system, and the carefully timed medication doses. Victor listened with the focused attention of someone accustomed to processing critical information under pressure. His questions were precise, clinical, designed to assess both her competence and her motives. You mentioned your brother earlier, he said, and Nora realized she had been speaking more freely than intended. Hospital experience? Public hospital. Pneumonia that turned into respiratory distress. No insurance, no money for private care. I know what it looks like when someone can't breathe, and I know what it sounds like when the people who are supposed to help don't have the resources to do their jobs properly. The words came out more bitter than she had intended. Victor studied her for a long moment, his gaze moving from her worn clothing to her competent handling of his son's medical crisis. What's your name? Nora. Nora Hale. She realized the irony of the shared surname only after she had spoken. Something shifted in Victor's expression. Not quite a smile, but a recognition of the coincidence that bordered on fate. The hospital's administrative corridors had transformed into something resembling a military operation within minutes of Victor's arrival. Men in expensive suits moved through the hallways with purposeful efficiency, their presence creating a ripple effect of nervous energy among the medical staff. Nora found herself at the center of negotiations that felt far beyond her comprehension, holding Eli's hand as his oxygen saturation finally stabilized at 96%. Victor had commandeered a private consultation room, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made hospital administrators materialize from their offices despite the early morning hour. Through the glass partition, Nora could see him speaking with rapid intensity to a woman in a white coat whose face had gone progressively paler with each document Victor's associates presented to her. "Miss Hale," Victor said, returning to where she sat beside Eli's temporary monitoring station. His son was breathing easily now, color returning to his cheeks, but remained connected to hospital equipment that tracked every vital sign with electronic precision. "I have a proposition for you." The way he said it made her stomach tighten with anticipation. In her experience, propositions from men who traveled with armed escorts rarely ended well for people in her economic bracket. But Eli's small fingers were still wrapped around hers, and she could feel the steady rhythm of his pulse against her wrist. Proof that her intervention had made a difference. "What kind of proposition?" she asked, keeping her voice neutral despite the adrenaline that had been coursing through her system for the past 2 hours. Victor pulled a chair closer, his expensive overcoat still bearing traces of snow from their outdoor encounter. "My son requires specialized care, and it's become clear that the standard hospital protocols are inadequate. Someone in this facility made a decision that could have killed him, either through incompetence or deliberate negligence. I can't afford to leave him in their care." He paused, his gaze moving to where Eli dozed fitfully under the warming blankets. "But you demonstrated competence under pressure. You recognized the symptoms, administered appropriate treatment, and potentially saved his life using improvised equipment and basic training. That kind of quick thinking and medical intuition is exactly what he needs." Nora felt a chill that had nothing to do with the hospital's air conditioning. "I'm not a nurse. I'm not qualified to provide medical care to a child with complex health issues. What I did back there was basic first aid, nothing more." $50,000, Victor said quietly, the number hanging in the air between them like a challenge. "Immediate payment, cash or transfer to whatever account you specify, plus $5,000 per week for as long as Eli requires monitoring and care. Your only responsibility would be to stay with him, watch for signs of respiratory distress, and ensure that anyone providing medical treatment follows his established protocols." The amount was staggering. $50,000 would eliminate her debt, pay her rent for 2 years, allow her to quit the delivery job and perhaps return to school for proper medical training. $5,000 per week was more than she currently made in 3 months of dawn-to-dawn bicycle deliveries through winter storms. "There are conditions," she said, because accepting that kind of money without understanding the full scope of expectations would be naive to the point of suicide. Victor nodded approvingly. "Speak them." "First, I need access to qualified medical supervision. If something goes wrong beyond basic respiratory support, I need to be able to call for help without interference. Second, I want a specific nurse reassigned to our case, someone with pediatric respiratory experience who can provide backup guidance. Third, I need written protocols for every medication, every treatment, and every emergency procedure that might be required." She paused, watching his reaction before continuing. "And fourth, if I ever feel that Eli's safety is being compromised for any reason, medical, personal, or otherwise, I walk away with no questions asked and no retaliation." Victor studied her for a long moment, and she could see him calculating risks and benefits with the precision of someone accustomed to high-stakes negotiations. "The nurse you mentioned, do you have someone specific in mind?" "Lila Moore. She was the only staff member who seemed concerned about the azithromycin administration when I mentioned it. She has pediatric experience and actually listened when I explained what I had observed." Nora had noticed the way the red-haired nurse had immediately begun pulling up Eli's allergy information when she overheard their conversation in the hallway. "Done. She'll be transferred to private duty within the hour." Victor reached into his overcoat and withdrew a checkbook that looked like it had never seen the inside of a budget grocery store. "The $50,000 is immediate. The weekly payments will be handled through my accountant with appropriate tax documentation." Nora watched him write numbers that represented more money than she had ever held in her hands. But there was something in his controlled efficiency that reminded her of the way he had knelt beside his son in the snow, the tremor in his hands when he thought no one was looking. "This isn't just about medical care," she said. "You're scared. Someone tried to hurt him, either through negligence or something worse, and you don't trust the system to protect him." Victor's pen paused over the signature line. "My son is the only thing in this world that matters to me. I have made many enemies in my business dealings, and some of them are not above using a child to send a message. Whether tonight was malicious or merely incompetent, the result could have been the same." He finished signing the check and handed it to her, the paper crisp and warm from his fingers. "Your job is to ensure that never happens again. To be the person watching when everyone else is distracted, checking when everyone else assumes. To be the one who notices when something doesn't match the protocols." Eli stirred on the monitoring bed, his eyes opening to focus on Nora's face. "Are you staying?" he asked, his voice stronger than it had been hours earlier, but still carrying the exhaustion of someone who had fought for every breath. "Yes," she said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "I'm staying." The transition to Victor's private residence happened with the same military precision that had characterized his arrival at the hospital. A medical transport vehicle equipped with portable monitoring equipment collected them at dawn, while Lila Moore rode alongside with a briefcase full of pediatric respiratory protocols and emergency medications. The house overlooked the Atlantic from a cliff that probably cost more per square foot than most people made in a year. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a view of gray winter ocean that stretched to the horizon, while the interior combined minimalist architecture with the kind of comfort that money could buy when price was no object. 3 days into their arrangement, the first signs of trouble arrived with the morning medication delivery. Nora was reviewing Eli's overnight respiratory readings when Lila burst through the medical suite's doors, her usually composed demeanor replaced by barely controlled panic. In her hands, she clutched a small plastic bag containing what should have been Eli's daily supply of specialized pediatric bronchodilators. "The shipment's been compromised," Lila announced, holding up an inhaler that looked identical to the prescribed medication, but bore subtle differences that made Nora's stomach clench with recognition. The lot number on the label didn't match the hospital pharmacy records, and the medication inside had an off-color tint that suggested either contamination or deliberate substitution. Victor materialized in the doorway within seconds of Lila's arrival, his presence filling the room with controlled tension. His hair was still damp from an early morning shower, but his eyes held the sharp focus of someone who had been awakened by security alerts rather than natural sleep patterns. Behind him, Rafe Dorian's bulk blocked the hallway, his hand resting casually inside his jacket. How many shipments were affected? Victor's voice carried the dangerous quiet that Nora had learned to recognize as a warning sign. When he spoke in that tone, people in expensive suits tended to develop sudden urgent business elsewhere. "Potentially all of them from the past week," Lila replied, spreading the suspect medications across the sterile counter surface. "Someone's been systematically replacing the legitimate supplies with near-identical counterfeits. The packaging is perfect, but the active ingredient concentrations are wrong. If Eli had used these during a severe episode..." She didn't need to finish the sentence. They all understood that compromised bronchodilators could transform a manageable asthma attack into a fatal respiratory crisis. The fact that someone had targeted a child's life-saving medication spoke to a level of malice that went far beyond simple medical negligence. Nora examined the counterfeit inhalers more closely, noting the microscopic differences in printing quality and the way the plastic components felt slightly different under her fingertips. This isn't amateur work. Whoever did this had access to pharmaceutical manufacturing equipment and detailed knowledge of Eli's specific medication requirements. "Dr. Halden Royce," Victor said, the name emerging from his lips like a curse. "Hospital administrator, financial oversight committee, and coincidentally, the physician who authorized Eli's azithromycin injection despite clear allergy warnings in his chart." Rafe stepped forward, withdrawing a manila folder from his jacket. "We've been investigating his financial records since the hospital incident. Turns out, Dr. Royce has been receiving substantial payments from Medflow Industries, a pharmaceutical distributor that specializes in, quote, cost-effective medication alternatives for high-value patients." The implications hit Nora like physical blow. He's been deliberately sabotaging treatment protocols to create demand for experimental therapies. Eli wasn't just a victim of negligence. He was specifically targeted because his father's wealth made him a valuable test subject. As if summoned by their conversation, the house's security system began emitting low-frequency alerts that made the windows vibrate in their frames. Victor's phone illuminated with incoming notifications from multiple sources, each message adding layers of complexity to an already dangerous situation. The main security monitor displayed feeds from cameras positioned throughout the property's perimeter, revealing dark vehicles assembling just beyond the legal boundary of Victor's land. "They're not waiting," Rafe observed, his tone carrying professional assessment rather than alarm. 3 vehicles, probably 6 men, positioned to monitor all exit routes. Someone's very interested in ensuring that the medication investigation doesn't proceed further. Eli stirred in his bed, awakened by the electronic sounds and the tension that seemed to fill the room like static electricity. His oxygen saturation readings remained stable, but Nora could see the way his shoulders tightened with anxiety as he registered the adult's concerned expressions. "Are we in danger?" Eli asked, his voice still carrying traces of sleep, but his eyes alert with intelligence that seemed far older than his 7 years. Victor moved to his son's bedside, his demeanor shifting instantly from dangerous authority figure to protective father. "Just some business complications that need to be handled carefully. Nora and Lila are going to make sure you stay safe while I take care of the problems." But even as he spoke, the house's advanced security system detected motion sensors being triggered along the cliffside approach paths. Someone was attempting to reach the residence through routes that would avoid the main security cameras, suggesting knowledge of the property's defensive layout that could only come from inside information. Nora felt her pulse accelerate as she realized the full scope of their situation. They were effectively trapped in a luxury fortress with a medically vulnerable child, facing opponents who had already demonstrated willingness to compromise life-saving medications. The counterfeit drugs weren't just evidence of corporate malfeasance. They were weapons designed to kill through the appearance of medical treatment. "Lila, I need you to prepare an emergency medical kit with verified medications from our backup supplies," Nora instructed, falling back on practical tasks to maintain focus. "Include everything we might need for severe respiratory distress, allergic reactions, and basic trauma care. If we have to move quickly, I want options that don't depend on outside pharmaceutical sources." The red-haired nurse nodded and began assembling supplies with the efficient movements of someone trained for crisis situations. Her hands shook slightly as she worked, but her clinical knowledge remained sharp under pressure. Victor was speaking rapidly into his phone, issuing instructions in coded language that suggested activation of contingency plans. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Nora could see additional vehicles arriving along the coastal road, reinforcements, but whether friendly or hostile remained unclear in the pre-dawn darkness. The pulse oximeter attached to Eli's wrist began beeping more rapidly, reflecting his elevated heart rate as stress hormones flooded his system. Nora moved quickly to his side, checking his breathing patterns and noting the slight wheeze that suggested his airways were beginning to constrict in response to anxiety. "I need to keep him calm," she told Victor. "But if his respiratory status deteriorates, we may need to evacuate to a hospital despite the security risks." The attack came at 4:17 in the morning, when the house's natural defenses were at their lowest, and Eli's breathing had finally settled into the steady rhythm of deep sleep. Nora was reviewing his overnight vital signs in the monitoring room when the building's emergency lighting activated, bathing the medical suite in harsh red illumination that made everything look like a crime scene. The first breach occurred through the cliffside service entrance, where someone had disabled the motion sensors using equipment that suggested professional-grade electronic warfare capabilities. Victor's security team had prepared for direct assault, but not for the sophisticated infiltration techniques that bypassed their primary detection systems through frequency jamming and thermal masking. Lila pressed herself against the medical supply cabinet as the sound of breaking glass echoed from the main level. Her hands shook as she clutched the emergency medical kit, but her voice remained steady when she spoke. "If they cut the power to the medical equipment, we'll have maybe 20 minutes of battery backup on the ventilation system." Nora felt ice form in her stomach as she realized the tactical implications. Whoever was orchestrating this assault understood that they didn't need to physically harm Eli to achieve their objective. They merely needed to compromise his medical support systems and wait for his respiratory condition to deteriorate naturally. It was murder disguised as medical emergency. The building's internal communication system crackled with Victor's voice, transmitted through the encrypted channels that connected the medical suite to his security command center. North Wing is compromised. 2 men in tactical gear, moving toward the main electrical system. Rafe is containing the breach, but they're using our own emergency protocols against us. Through the reinforced windows, Nora could see muzzle flashes illuminating the coastal darkness like deadly fireflies. The sound of gunfire was muffled by the building's construction, but each bright flicker represented lethal force being exchanged in the corridors below. This wasn't a simple robbery or intimidation attempt. It was a coordinated elimination effort designed to look like collateral damage from a home invasion. Eli's pulse oximeter began emitting faster beeps as stress hormones flooded his system, triggering the early stages of anxiety-induced bronchospasm. Nora moved quickly to his bedside, checking his breathing patterns and noting the slight increase in respiratory rate that indicated his airways were beginning to constrict. "I need to get him stabilized before this gets worse," she told Lila, drawing up a measured dose of albuterol from their verified medication supplies. "If his condition deteriorates during a firefight, we won't be able to evacuate him safely." The power fluctuated twice, causing the medical monitors to flicker and reset their baseline readings. Each interruption lasted only milliseconds, but it confirmed Nora's worst fears about the attackers' knowledge of the house's critical systems. They were systematically targeting the infrastructure that kept Eli alive, using his medical vulnerability as a weapon against his father. Victor appeared in the doorway, his expensive clothing torn and stained with blood that didn't appear to be his own. In his hands, he carried a modified tablet that displayed real-time feeds from security cameras throughout the property. His face bore the controlled fury of a man watching his sanctuary being violated by people who had turned his son's illness into a tactical advantage. "We have maybe 10 minutes before they reach the medical wing," he said, his voice carrying the clipped efficiency of someone who had transitioned fully into combat mode. "The main elevator shaft is compromised, but the service stairs are still clear. We can evacuate through the garage level if necessary." "He can't be moved during an active respiratory episode," Nora replied, administering the bronchodilator through the nebulizer system while monitoring Eli's oxygen saturation. "The stress of evacuation could trigger a full bronchospasm attack. We need to hold position until his breathing stabilizes." The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. They were trapped between the medical necessity of keeping Eli stationary and the security imperative of removing him from the building before the attackers reached their location. Every option carried potentially fatal risks. An explosion somewhere below them caused the entire structure to vibrate, and several pieces of medical equipment briefly lost power before their backup systems engaged. The sound was followed by the distinctive whine of emergency sirens from multiple directions, suggesting that Victor's security protocols had automatically summoned law enforcement and emergency medical services. But Nora realized with growing horror that the attackers had anticipated this response. The timing of their assault coincided with the shift change at the local hospital, when ambulance availability would be at its lowest. Even if they could evacuate Eli, there might not be appropriate medical transport available to handle a child with complex respiratory needs. "They're not just trying to kill him," she said, the tactical picture becoming clear in her mind. "They're creating a situation where he dies from medical complications that can be blamed on the home invasion." Dr. Halden probably provided them with detailed information about his condition and the support systems he requires. Victor's expression darkened as he processed the implications. "So this entire assault is designed to look like random violence, while specifically targeting the medical infrastructure that keeps my son alive." The realization seemed to strip away the last vestiges of restraint that had been governing Victor's response to the threat. His phone calls shifted from defensive coordination to something that sounded like the mobilization of considerably more dangerous resources. Through the intercom system, Rafe's voice reported success in neutralizing the immediate threats to the electrical systems, but warned that additional personnel were approaching the property through routes that suggested detailed reconnaissance of the building's defensive layout. Eli's condition finally began to improve as the medication took effect, his oxygen saturation climbing back toward normal ranges and his breathing becoming less labored. But the sound of his father orchestrating lethal countermeasures in hushed phone conversations made Nora acutely aware that she had become part of something far more dangerous than simple medical care. Dawn broke across the Atlantic, like a promise of redemption. painting the horizon in shades of pearl and gold that filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the medical suite. Eli sat propped against pillows, his breathing steady and unlabored for the first time in days, watching the waves break against the cliff face below. The pulse oximeter on his wrist displayed a steady 98% oxygen saturation, its gentle beeping now a reassuring rhythm rather than an urgent alarm. 3 weeks had passed since the night that changed everything. The immediate crisis had resolved with surgical precision. Dr. Halden Royce's financial records exposed a web of pharmaceutical fraud that extended far beyond Eli's case, while the attackers who had breached the house were revealed to be employees of the same medical supply company that had been distributing counterfeit medications to high-value patients across the region. Nora stood beside Eli's bed, reviewing his morning respiratory assessment, with the satisfaction of seeing numbers that consistently fell within normal ranges. Her role had evolved beyond emergency medical care into something that resembled actual nursing, complete with official certification coursework that Victor had arranged through a private medical college. The delivery uniform had been replaced by professional scrubs, and her cracked smartphone had given way to a tablet loaded with pediatric respiratory protocols. "The foundation paperwork is finalized," Victor announced from the doorway, holding a leather portfolio that contained documents representing months of legal and financial planning. The Eli Hale Pediatric Respiratory Center will open next month in the Harbor District, with full funding for equipment, staffing, and operations for the next decade. The facility would occupy a renovated building just 6 blocks from the hospital where Eli's crisis had begun, designed specifically to provide emergency respiratory care for children whose families couldn't afford private treatment. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. Victor's response to nearly losing his son had been to ensure that other children would never face the same medical negligence due to economic circumstances. Lila emerged from the adjacent preparation room, carrying a tray of medications that represented the new normal of Eli's care routine. Every inhaler, every nebulizer solution, every emergency bronchodilator had been verified through independent laboratories and sourced from suppliers with verified chain-of-custody documentation. The counterfeit medication scandal had shaken Victor's confidence in traditional medical supply networks so completely that he now maintained his own pharmaceutical testing facility. His peak flow readings are consistently above 85% of predicted values, Lila reported, referring to the lung function tests that had become part of Eli's daily routine. "He's responding well to the new prevention protocol, and we haven't had a single episode of bronchospasm in 2 weeks." The transformation in Victor himself had been equally dramatic. The dangerous edge that had characterized his initial response to the crisis had evolved into something more purposeful and sustainable. He had redirected the resources and connections that once served purely protective functions toward creating systemic changes in pediatric emergency care. The man who had once solved problems through intimidation and financial leverage now worked through medical conferences and healthcare policy committees. "Nora," Victor said, his tone carrying the weight of decisions that had been weeks in the making. "I have a proposal that goes beyond our current arrangement." She looked up from Eli's chart, noting the careful formality in his voice that usually preceded significant announcements. Over the past 3 weeks, she had learned to read the subtle indicators that marked his transition from father to businessman to something that approximated a partner in the complex enterprise of keeping his son healthy. The respiratory center needs a director of emergency services, someone with practical experience in crisis intervention and the kind of medical intuition that can't be taught in textbooks. The position comes with full administrative authority, a staff of 6 specialists, and compensation that reflects the critical nature of the work. The offer represented more than just career advancement. It was an invitation to transform the emergency medical response that had saved Eli's life into a systematic capability that could save other children facing similar crises. It was also recognition that her value extended beyond her willingness to remain at Eli's bedside during dangerous circumstances. "What about Eli?" she asked, because despite all the professional opportunities and financial security, the 7-year-old boy had become the center of her daily concerns in ways that went beyond simple employment obligations. Eli looked up from the tablet where he had been working on breathing exercises disguised as video games, his expression showing intelligence that seemed to grow more adult each day. "I want to help other kids who can't breathe," he said with the directness that characterized most of his observations. And I want you to be the one who teaches them. The simplicity of his statement contained weeks of overheard conversations and careful observation of the adults who had reorganized their lives around his medical needs. He understood, with the clarity that sometimes comes to children who have faced their own mortality, that their experience had meaning beyond his individual survival. Victor moved to the windows, his gaze following the path of a fishing boat making its way toward the harbor. The center will include a residential training facility for family members and caregivers. Breathing techniques, emergency response protocols, medication management. The kind of education that turns parents into first responders when minutes matter more than medical degrees. 6 months later, the Harbor District Pediatric Respiratory Center had processed over 400 emergency consultations, prevented dozens of hospitalizations, and established itself as a model for community-based pediatric emergency care. The facility's central monitoring room displayed real-time data from home monitoring systems distributed throughout the region, creating an early warning network that could detect respiratory emergencies before they became life-threatening. Nora stood in the center's main treatment room, supervising a training session where parents learned to recognize the signs of respiratory distress in their own children. On the wall behind her, a plaque bore a simple inscription: "Power isn't who makes the breathing stop, it's who teaches others to help it begin again." Through the window, she could see Eli playing in the center's therapeutic garden, his laughter carrying across the space as he demonstrated proper inhaler technique to a group of younger patients. His breathing remained steady and strong, supported by knowledge rather than fear, protected by competence rather than isolation. The pulse oximeter on his wrist now served as education equipment rather than emergency monitoring, a tool for teaching other children that medical devices could be instruments of empowerment rather than anxiety. The morning sun reflected off the harbor waters, constant and reliable, marking the rhythm of days that had settled into purposeful routine. Sometimes, the most extraordinary transformations begin with the smallest acts of kindness. Just like Nora's decision to stop for a child in distress led to a complete revolution in pediatric emergency care, your compassion and awareness might be exactly what someone needs in their darkest moment. The Harbor District Pediatric Respiratory Center continues to grow today, serving families who never imagined they could afford quality medical care. Every child who learns to manage their breathing, every parent who gains confidence in emergency response, every life saved through early intervention traces back to one delivery driver who chose to act when action mattered most. What incredible stories of unexpected heroism and life-changing encounters would you like to see next? If this tale of courage, transformation, and the power of human connection moved you, please hit that like button. It helps us reach more people who need to hear these inspiring stories. Subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss the incredible journeys we share every week. Have you ever witnessed a moment when someone's small act of kindness created ripple effects that changed everything? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We love reading about real-life heroes who prove that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when they choose compassion over convenience. Until next time, remember that you never know when your next decision to help someone might transform not just their life, but your entire destiny.